If anyone will take the four gospel records of the trial of Jesus by Pontius Pilate, and having put them side by side, make a careful comparative study of them, he will find them absolutely unanimous upon one point, that Pilate addressed to Jesus the question, quote, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Now this is significant because the two earlier evangelists give no hint that Pilate had even been told what the charge was. But Matthew and Mark, with their accustomed brevity and that complete absence of subsidiary detail characteristic of them, describe Pilate as asking this leading question at once, thus. Mark: And straightway in the morning the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council held a consultation and bound Jesus, and carried him away and delivered him up to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Mark 15:1 and 2. Matthew: Now when morning was come, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away, and delivered him up to Pilate the governor. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Matthew 27:1, 2, and 11. It is perfectly obvious that this could not, in any circumstances, have been the beginning of these proceedings. Both of these synoptic writers have jumped over something that is exceedingly important for us to know: how this vital and rather peculiar question was led up to, and what it was that caused Pilate to ask it. Fortunately, we have two other independent versions to which we can turn, and I will ask the listener to examine these with some care. To facilitate comparison, we will set them out fully. Luke: And the whole company of them rose up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Luke 23:1 through 3. John: Pilate therefore went out unto them, and saith, "What accusation bring ye against this man?" They answered and said unto him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him up unto thee." Pilate therefore saith unto them, "Take him yourselves, and judge him according to your law." The Jews said unto him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death," that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what manner of death he should die. Pilate therefore entered again into the palace, and called Jesus, and said unto him, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" John 18:29 through 33. Two things stand out from these accounts. First, they offer a much fuller and more intelligible account of what happened. But second, and chiefly, Pilate's question comes, as we knew it must, after some preliminary interchange of argument with the Jews. It is that preliminary phase of the trial to which I want to direct particular attention. If we were left solely with the evidence and witness of Luke, we should have to assume that the moment the priests brought their prisoner to the bar, they launched their general accusation thus: "We found this man perverting our nation, and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Let it be said here that, psychologically, this would have been a perfectly natural and satisfactory opening to the case, and if no other data were available, we should be justified, even compelled, to assume that it began in that way. But there is something in the version of the fourth gospel that arrests attention, because it throws new light on the way in which the case was presented from the Jewish side. It is not that the writer of John's version contradicts what the synoptic writers have said. On the contrary, he confirms it. But he seems to begin a little farther back, and he supplies a link in the narrative that is missing from the other three. He states first, on every ground we must regard as most probable, that when Jesus was brought to Pilate, the prisoner himself was conducted into the palace, while the priests and other accusers remained outside. After a short interval, according to John, Pilate came out and put the formal question to the Jews, quote, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" End quote. This was the definite opening of the Roman trial, for it was an essential part of the Roman system that a public accusatio should be made, followed by the interrogatio of the judge and the executio of the prisoner. The reply of the priest to this question is so significant and suggestive that I don't think due weight has been given to it. The priest replied, "If this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him up unto thee." Before we consider what this phrase means, let us look again closely at the narratives of Luke and John, printed side by side on pages 52 and 53. It is obvious even upon the cursory reading that there is a gap in John's version following the words, quote, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death," end quote. In no conceivable circumstance could Pilate have passed directly from the evasive and resentful answer to his leading question to Jesus, quote, "Art thou then a king?" End quote. Some intervening conversation must have led up to it. Fortunately, the missing sentence has been furnished by Luke, and we may therefore fill the gap as shown in the complete narrative printed following. The reconstructed narrative of the opening of the Roman trial. Roman trial. Presentation of the prisoner to Pilate. They led Jesus therefore from Caiaphas into the palace, and it was early, and they themselves entered not into the palace, that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Pilate's demand for the accusatio. Pilate therefore went out unto them, and saith, What accusation bring ye against this man? The priest's obvious reluctance to produce a charge. Pilate's rejoinder. They answered and said unto him, If this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him up unto thee. Pilate therefore said unto them, Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The priests reply with an improvised charge. The Jews said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this man perverting our nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Pilate's question to the prisoner. Pilate therefore entered again into the palace, and called Jesus, and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? Not only does this reconstructed narrative contain the essential facts recorded by the four writers in the order in which they give them, but it is really the only account we possess of these proceedings. For as an examination of the documents will show, the four writers are almost unanimous when their particular point of entry has been reached. Moreover, it reads like an authentic piece of history. With this description now before us, we can attempt a reconstruction of an incident which, both historically and psychologically, is probably without precedent in the annals of the world. The first definite act of the drama of which we have historical record is the bringing of Jesus from the place of his confinement, probably the high priest's house, to the place of trial. This occupied perhaps 20 minutes, but as it was still quite early, probably few people witnessed the little procession as it made its way swiftly through the narrow streets of Old Jerusalem. The procurator himself, astir early, was awaiting the deputation. On arrival at the gate of the palace, we must probably allow for a halt of a few minutes for the examination of credentials, after which the prisoner was conducted alone, under a Roman escort, to the presence chamber of Pilate. Meanwhile, the deputation and their attendants waited without. We come now to a point of considerable interest. After a brief interval, Pilate himself came out to the Jewish deputation and put the question, quote, What accusation do you bring against this man? End quote. As I have said earlier, this was an unmistakable indication that Pilate intended to rehear the case, and it seems to have aroused intense resentment on the part of the priests, for their answer is not only lacking in proper respect for Pilate, who was acting fully within his duty, but points to their having a special grievance against him in this matter. If this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him up unto thee. Assuming, as I do, the historicity of this reply, it seems to me that there is only one possible interpretation to be placed on it. The priests resented Pilate's sudden determination to rehear the case. They were clearly under the impression that he would not insist on a formal restatement of the case against Jesus, and they appeared to have come without any prepared or public accusation at all. If we were to attempt a broad, but I think quite legitimate paraphrase, we may regard the priest as saying, quote, Can't you be satisfied with the finding of our court that this man is an evildoer? Why reopen the case when we ourselves have found him worthy of death? End quote. To this Pilate made a very subtle reply. Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The inevitable answer to this skillful counterthrust was a renewed demand for ratification. It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. It would seem then that, realizing the hopelessness of getting what they wanted without the production of a case, they began to accuse him, saying, We found this man perverting our nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. The mention of the words, quote-unquote, a king, at last gave Pilate something to work on, and he retired into the palace to put the historic question to Jesus. Quote, Art thou the king of the Jews? End quote. Now there are two things about this episode which call for special notice. First, it reads like a transcript from life. Second, the manifest resentment and surprise shown by the priests when Pilate indicated his intention of rehearing the case, or at any rate of closely examining the prisoner, points unmistakably to something resembling an understanding. They would hardly have made so insolent and pointed a reference to ratification of their own sentence if they had not been led in some way to expect it. But when we place this fact in juxtaposition with that other fact, the urgency of Claudia's reported message to her husband, its intrinsic probability is increased. We began to see why Claudia was so anxious to get her message into her husband's hands before it was too late. For if events took the course that it seems they must have done, Claudia knew not merely the identity of the prisoner when she retired to rest, but she knew also that Pilate was contemplating, if he had not already promised, the ratification of the Jewish sentence. It was this that gave the whole point to her hurried communication. She wanted to tell him at all costs not to take that course. If this is a true reading of this remarkable episode, then one thing stands out clearly. The message Claudia Procula sent to Pontius Pilate on the morning of the crucifixion changed in certain essential respects the course of history. If Pilate actually received this message, he must have done so shortly after his arrival at the palace of trial, for high-strung women are generally light sleepers, and the whole tenor of the message suggests its hurried indictment on waking. That Pilate had come down to the audience chamber intending formally to ratify the Jewish sentence seems to be certain. Before the deputation arrived, however, something happened that caused him to change his mind. But not only so, psychological states have the peculiarity when suddenly challenged of swinging to their opposite extremes, and Pilate throughout his dealings with the Jews on this particular morning seems to have had one concern only: to shift the responsibility for the affair to others. The fact is ineradicable from the pages of the narrative. We find it in his initial attempt to get the Jews to carry out their own sentence. We find it in the thrice proclaimed public acquittal of the prisoner. We find it in the remission to Herod. We find it supremely in that tense moment when, unable any longer to make himself heard above the tumult, he washed his hands as a sign that he would have no part in it. So, in a member of Pilate's own household, we discover the fourth factor in the psychological parallelogram of personal forces that brought about the death of Christ. The influence of Jesus on the women of his day was profound and of surpassing interest. He took Mary Magdalene from her native Magdala and made her his bondslave forever. He took the sons and breadwinners away from the women like Salome and Mary, the wife of Cleophas. Yet they would have died willingly for his cause, and did later endure unspeakable hardships on his account. He was the close and intimate friend of cultured women like Mary and her sister Martha. He had in Joanna a faithful and devoted follower in the very household of Herod. Must we add Claudia to the circle of his adherents? In the sense of actual discipleship, no. But in the sense that in some mysterious way she had come under the impress of his moral influence and his commanding spiritual and intellectual stature, I think we must say yes. It was she who stiffened the Roman instinct for justice in Pilate at a moment when she was tempted, from personal considerations, to humor the prejudices of the Jewish Camarilla and commit Jesus on their recommendation alone. It was she who was the author of that resplendent phase when the tyrant was seen for a few hours in the guise of a patient administrator anxious to weigh the truth to the last ounce. Let us not belittle this glowing, if transient, chapter in Pilate's checkered life. While the stimulus lasted, his handling of this difficult and perplexing case was well nigh perfect. No more just hearing than this could any man have asked or obtained in any court of that far-off day. The restraining influence of one who clearly believed that Jesus was innocent is obviously upon it. It was only as the stimulus faded against the grinding and growing opposition of the Jewish party that the threat of Caesar's intervention became paramount, and he ended as he intended to begin, by delivering the prisoner into their hands. So the battle of wills closed in the defeat of the Roman procurator, and it was probably a sad and intensely irritated man who made his way back to the imperial apartments of the royal palace. But we do not have to wait long for the repercussion. A few hours later, the priest came back to him again. In his haste, or perhaps out of a coarse wish to turn the tables on his tormentors, he had written in 3 languages the immortal inscription, quote, "This is the King of the Jews," end quote. They wanted him to alter it. He refused. "What I have written, I have written." The real Pilate came out at last, when the supreme moment of his personal and individual crisis had passed.